Hey, everybody, tune in to Recent Tartarians.
Recent Tartarians. Recent Tartarians.
You shall understand that which perhaps you scarce think credible, that about 3,000 years ago, or somewhat more, the navigation of the world, especially for remote voyages, was greater than at this day. The example of the Ark that saved the remnant of men from the universal deluge, it gave men confidence to adventure upon the waters. The Phoenicians, and especially the Tyrians, had great fleets. So had the Carthaginians, their colony, which is yet further to the west. Towards the east, the shipping of Egypt and of Palestine was likewise great, and the great Tartary, and the great Atlantis, that which you call America. At that time, this land was known and frequented by the ships and vessels of all nations before named, and as it cometh to pass, they had many times men of other countries that were no sailors that came with them, as Persians and Chaldeans and Arabians, so as almost all nations of might and fame resorted hither. And for our own ships, they went sundry voyages, as well as to your straits, which you call the Pillars of Hercules, as to other parts in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean seas, as to Paguin, which is the same with Cambalan and Quincy, upon the Oriental seas, and as far as to the borders of East Tartary. Sir Francis Bacon, New Atlantis. New Atlantis first appeared in the back of Silva Salvarum, a rather thorny work of natural history that was published by William Raleigh, Sir Francis Bacon's secretary. When Silva Salvarum was entered into the Stationer's Register of July 4th, 1626, 3 months after Bacon's death, no mention was made of New Atlantis, and it wasn't until 1670 that it was included on Silva Salvarum's letterpress title page. New Atlantis was included in the Magnalia Naturae, which most commentators tend to ignore, probably because it's difficult to link either to Silva Salvarum or New Atlantis with any surety. New Atlantis was then published as an individual text by Thomas Newcomb in 1659. But in general, New Atlantis appears to have been a text that no one quite knew what to do with. Certainly Raleigh's letter to the reader indicates that he was less than clear as to its purpose, even though he later published it in Latin translations within the collection Opera Moralium et Civilium Thomas in 1638. In 1662, an explicitly Rosicrucian version appeared as the preface to John Hayden's Holy Guide. Sir Francis Bacon, in a rather roundabout way, can be seen as forming the New World, as we now know it, anyway. His influence is not as popularized as Isaac Newton's, but maybe he was the giant whose shoulders Newton could stand. Sir Francis Bacon, also known as Lord Verulam, was an English philosopher and statesman who served as the Attorney General and as Lord Chancellor of England. His works are seen as developing the scientific method and remained influential throughout the scientific revolution. But particularly, Bacon is a figurehead of the so-called Enlightenment movement. Bacon has been called the father of empiricism. He argued for the possibility of scientific knowledge based upon inductive reasoning and careful observations of events in nature. Most importantly, he argued science could be achieved by the use of skeptical and methodical approach, whereby scientists aim to avoid misleading themselves. Although his most specific proposals about such a method, the Baconian method, as it's called, did not have long-lasting influence and was quickly superseded, the general idea of the importance and possibility of a skeptical methodology made Bacon famous in the Enlightenment to the proponents of the scientific method. This method was a post-Socratic, new rhetorical and theoretical framework for science, whose practical details are still central to the debate on science and methodology today. Sir Francis Bacon was a patron of libraries and developed a system for cataloging books under 3 categories: history, poetry, and philosophy. Bacon could later further divide these into specific subjects and subheadings. About books, Bacon is credited with saying, "Some books are to be tasted, others swallowed, and some few to be chewed up and digested." Bacon was educated at Trinity College in Cambridge, where he rigorously followed the medieval curriculum, largely in Latin. Francis Bacon was the first recipient of the Queen's Counsel designation, conferred in 1597 when Elizabeth I of England reserved him as her legal advisor. After the accession of James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, in the union of Scottish and English crowns in 1603, Bacon was knighted, then created Baron Verulam in 1618, and became Viscount St. Alban in 1621. Sir Francis Bacon had no heirs, and so both titles became extinct on his death in 1626 at the age of 65. Francis died of pneumonia, with one account by John Aubrey stating that he had contracted it while studying the effects of freezing on meat preservation. A characteristic hermeneutical circle underlies Bacon's natural philosophy, a circle that, depending on the chosen point of view, could be regarded at the time as either virtuous or vicious. On one hand, Bacon was convinced that man's self-knowledge rested on the knowledge that nature has of itself. Since nature is first and foremost appetite, and man's essence is rooted in appetite. On the other hand, he was also convinced that knowledge of nature was based on knowledge of the self. The world was a vast labyrinth, amid the windings of which we require some clue or thread whereby we may track our way to knowledge and thence to power. This thread, called by some the filum labyrinthiae, is the new method of induction. Tragically, as has been frequently pointed out, the new method could not be applied until facts had been observed and collected. This is an indispensable preliminary. Man, the servant and the interpreter of nature, can do and understand so much, and so much only as he has observed in fact or in thought of the course of nature. Beyond this, the human being neither knows anything nor can do anything. The proposition that our knowledge of nature necessarily begins with observation and experience is common to Bacon and many contemporary reformers of science. But Bacon laid peculiar stress upon it and gave it new meaning, at least since the days of St. Thomas Aquinas.
Soul of the age, the applause, delight, the wonder of our stage, our Shakespeare, rise, our Shakespeare. For he is all of ours, is he not? The most performed playwright of all time, the author of 37 plays, 154 sonnets, and several narrative poems that are collectively known as the ultimate expressions of humanity in the English language. And yet, not a single manuscript of any kind has ever been found written in Shakespeare's own hand. In 400 years, not one document. He was born the son of a glove maker, and at some unknown time, armed, but with a grammar school education, he went to London, where, the story goes, he became an actor and eventually a playwright. He died at the age of 52, and he was survived by his wife and two daughters, who, like Shakespeare's own father, were irrefutably illiterate. His will famously left his second-best bed to his widow, but it made no mention of a single book or manuscript. Our Shakespeare is a cipher, a ghost. So, let me offer you a different story, a darker story.
Now, it is also believed that Sir Francis Bacon concealed messages in a variety of ciphers. Bacon's cipher, or the Baconian cipher, is a method of steganographic message encoding devised by Sir Francis Bacon in 1605. There has been much speculation as to Baconian ciphers relating to a secret history of time, as well as the esoteric secrets of the Rosicrucians, even perhaps in works by Bacon published anonymously or under pseudonym. It is well known that Francis Bacon often gathered with men at the Gray's Inn to discuss politics and philosophy. Notoriously, Bacon also tried out various theatrical scenes, which he admitted to writing himself. Bacon's alleged connection to the Rosicrucians and the Freemasons has been widely discussed by authors and scholars in many books. The Rosicrucian organization, Amorc, claims that Bacon was the imperator or leader of the Rosicrucian order in both England and across the European continent, and would have directed the Rosicrucians during his lifetime. The Baconian theory of Shakespeare authorship holds that Sir Francis Bacon, the philosopher, essayist, and scientist, also wrote the plays which were publicly attributed to William Shakespeare. Allegedly, an illiterate actor paid to play the writer. Various explanations are offered for this alleged subterfuge, most commonly that Bacon's rise to high office might have been hindered were it to become known that he wrote plays for the public stage. Thus, these plays were allegedly credited to this actor, Shakespeare, who was merely a front man or shield for the identity of Sir Francis Bacon. The question of true authorship of Shakespeare's plays really began when the play Richard II was performed in 1600. This time with some scenes included that were not in the printed 1598 edition, though were later included in the 1608 reprint. Robert Cecil, the Lord Privy Seal for the Queen Elizabeth and Queen Elizabeth herself, adjudged those scenes to be seditious and set out to discover the true identity of the writer. Elizabeth also objected to John Hayward's the first part of the life and reign of King Henry IV, which he had dedicated to the Earl of Essex, who was later executed for treason, even though Cecil had given Bacon the task of finding the true author. Bacon was later the first serious alternative candidate suggested as the author of Shakespeare's style of plays. Safe for centuries, it wasn't until 1880 that Ignatius L. Donnelly, a U.S. congressman and science fiction author, as well as Atlantis theorist, wrote The Great Cryptogram, a book in which he argued that Sir Francis Bacon revealed his authorship of the Shakespearean works by concealing these secret ciphers within the text. This revelation provoked a plethora of late 19th century Baconian theorizing, which developed the theme that Bacon had hidden encoded messages in many, if not all, of the plays, and perhaps in more of his writings. Baconian theory developed a new twist in the writings of Orville Ward Owen and Elizabeth Wells Gallup. Owen's book Sir Francis Bacon's Cipher Story in 1895 claimed to have discovered a secret history of the Elizabethan era hidden in cipher form in Bacon or Shakespeare's works. The most remarkable revelation was that Bacon was the illegitimate son of Queen Elizabeth, according to Owen. Bacon revealed that Elizabeth was secretly married to Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, who fathered both Bacon himself and Robert de Vaux, 2nd Earl of Essex, the latter ruthlessly executed by his own mother in 1601 in order to protect her throne. By this cryptogram, it would seem apparent that Sir Francis Bacon was the illegitimate yet true heir to the throne of England and the Scottish crown. Bacon had been excluded from his rightful place. This tragic life story was the secret hidden in the plays. But it's not an open and shut case. In fact, American cryptologists William and Elizabeth Friedman, critics of the Shakespeare-Baconian cipher claims, using typographical analysis, especially in the first folio, used not 2, but 4 different typefaces, instead of the 2 required for the normal Baconian cipher. Printing press technology at this time would have made it nearly impossible to transmit a message accurately using only one work, and it would be necessary to have another printed work as a key. Yet what could that key be? Back to New Atlantis, Sir Francis Bacon's Silva Salvarum, or A Natural History in 10 Centuries, written by the Right Honorable Francis Lowe Verulam, Viscount of St. Albans, published after the author's death by William Raleigh, Doctor in Divinity, one of His Majesty's chaplainers. Hereunto is now added an alphabetical table of the principle of things contained in the 10 centuries. Even that title occupies a paradoxical place in the history of the 17th century for both medicine and natural philosophy. Silva Salvarum tended to be seen or read as a collection of materials for building the new science that Bacon is slightly modifying from the ancient Renaissance. The definition of the word Silva he has stolen, creating a new genre. Traditionally, Silva was used to designate the materials necessary for the construction of a discourse or speech. Bacon is not the first one to move the term into the field of natural history and natural philosophy, but Bacon expounded at his clearest and his best in vernacular and not in Latin his views on the material appetites of nature. And he did so not by writing in abstract, but by describing and performing experiments aimed at disclosing the appetite of nature, of matter. Such an original model of experimental investigations on the appetites of matter were abandoned by the great majority of Bacon's followers, especially those associated with the Royal Society. They were replaced with the more reassuring project to mechanize the natural forms and passions of matter, which has teleologically led us to the biomimicry of technology today. For the Royal Society, by taming nature, man was restored as the proper subject of knowledge and appetite, whereas nature was left with its status as a lifeless object of dispassionate study. Sort of a George Orwell fairy tale, New Atlantis may have been Bacon's vision for a utopian New World Order in the Western Hemisphere of the Americas. In New Atlantis, there would be religious freedom, equality in an island state. It's been argued that this work has influenced other reforms. Many suffragists and abolitionists championed New Atlantis for greater rights for women and the abolition of slavery and the elimination of debtors' prisons and separation of church and state. Even the concept of freedom of political expression. In Sir Francis Bacon's demonstrative analogy of a state functioning with these attributes. Bacon's propositions of legal reforms, which were not established in his lifetime, are considered to have been some of the most important influences behind the Napoleonic Code, and therefore could show some resemblance or influence in the drafting of other liberal constitutions that came in the centuries after Bacon's time, such as the American Constitution. While it is clear that the Rosicrucians played a heavy-handed role in the Dutch colonies, I think it's fair to say that Sir Francis Bacon played a leading role, either in secret or in inspiration, in the creation of the English colonies, especially in the Virginias and in the Carolinas, and in Newfoundland in northeast Canada. Bacon's government report on the Virginia colony was submitted in 1609. In 1610, Bacon and his associates received a charter from the king to form the treasurer and the company of the adventurers and planters of the city of London and Bristol for the colony or plantation in Newfoundland, and sent John Guy to found a colony there. In 1910, Newfoundland issued a postage stamp to commemorate Bacon's role in establishing their province. The stamp described Bacon as the guiding spirit in colonization scheme. Moreover, some scholars believed he was largely responsible for the drafting, in 1609 and 1612, of two charters of government for the Virginia colony. Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States and author of the Declaration of Independence, wrote, "Bacon, Locke, and Newton. I consider them as the three greatest men that have ever lived, without any exception, and as having laid the foundation of those superstructures which have been raised in physical and moral sciences."
Like other people say, I just said they are having more influence on kids and things than anything else, including Jesus.
Historian and biographer William Hepworth Dixon considered that Bacon's name could be included in the list of founders of the United States of America. 13 years later, after Bacon's Virginia colony government report and drafting of two constitutions, and after his own death, released into the pages of a book less than likely to become a bestseller, New Atlantis depicts a mythical island called Bensalem, which is discovered by the crew of a European ship after they are lost in the Pacific Ocean, somewhere west of Peru. This minimal plot serves the gradual unfolding of the ways of this island, its customs, but most importantly, its state-sponsored scientific institution, the Solomon House, which house or college is the very eye of this kingdom. These Bensalem scientists are philosopher-rulers who investigate everything, but decide for themselves which discoveries are beneficial for release to the public or to the king of the state. This assumes that none of their scientists will ever do anything for personal glory or gain. It assumes that the public will accept gratefully the guidance of their intellectuals and never misuse what the latter beneficently let them have. And it assumes that the intellectuals will never accidentally cause mayhem with the unforeseen consequences of consumerism and the military-industrial complex, or leaded petrol, pesticides, antibiotics, or plastic. and it assumes that no king would ever think of bribing or torturing the philosophers, practices which were common before and during Bacon's lifetime, as he was personally familiar as a tutor and steward politician to gain power over their subjects or start building empires. And Bacon assumes something else very strange: objectivity in empiricism. Empiricism is to observe nature based on one's own observations in order to attempt to find out about underlying principles, laws, or systems of reality. Alternatively, in logical conclusions, we derive a theoretical system, which we try to validate via observations. Often science and common thought is dominated not by empiricism, but in actuality derived by the method of scholasticism. Scholasticism is the preference to rely on authoritative sources as opposed to one's own empirical observations, which may be flawed, wherever one is in question. In the Christian Middle Ages, authoritative sources referred to the writings of Aristotle, the fathers of the Church, and the Holy Bible. Today, it might be the works of Neil deGrasse Tyson and CNN. When making a hypothesis, to rely on the works of the celebrities and saints and scholars to find a popular chain of acceptable logic and rhetoric, leading to one of the canonical sources, may be more socially acceptable, but often finds contradictions. Scholasticism means that the world, as well as the view of the world, is fixed by its canonical interpretations and cannot be changed. In consequence, this might easily become an obstacle for scientific progress.
They will belong to the world. A world filled with evil and temptation.
Many aspects of the society and history of the island Bensalem are described. An interesting phenomenon on the island of Bensalem is the subject of Christianity, which is reported to have been born there, as a copy of the Bible and a letter from the Apostle Church Bartholomew arrived there miraculously, washing up on the shores. A few years after the ascension of Jesus, a fantastical idea later corroborated by Joseph Smith. And so is erected a college of sages known as the Solomon House, the very eye of the kingdom, to which order, God of heaven and earth, has vouchsafed the grace to know the works of creation, and the secrets of them, as well as to discern between divine miracles, works of nature, works of art, and the impostures and illusions of all sorts, the vanities and vexations of spirit, if you will, and a series of instruments, processes, and methods of scientific research that were employed in this island by the College of Sages, the Solomon House. The interlocutors include the governor of the House of Strangers, Jobin, the Jew, and the head of the Solomon House. And do I need to mention the Spanish Inquisition for context in order for this plot device to impact appropriately? Probably.
The Inquisition. Let's begin the Inquisition. Look out, Sid. We have a mission to convert the Jews.
Because nobody expected the Spanish Inquisition's effect to be so drastic in 1483, when many families of Jewish Spaniards were expelled from all of Andalusia.
We're gonna teach them wrong from right. We're gonna help them see the light and make an offer that they can't refuse. That the Jews just can't refuse.
And by the 1600s, for centuries, the Spanish Inquisition against everyone from Muslims and Jews to pagans and Gnostics had been waging.
It's better to lose your skull cap than your skull. The Inquisition, what a show. The Inquisition, here we go. We know you're wishing that we'd go away.
And would continue for several centuries longer, clear into the 19th century.
But the Inquisition's here and it's here to stay.
Oh boy, the Inquisition, what joy. The Inquisition, oi, oi.
Not just in Spain, but indeed across all of Europe. The Inquisition was originally intended primarily to identify heretics, but quickly became used to root out Judaism and Islam in Spain, which had become legally a Catholic state. The regulations of the faith of newly converted Catholics was intensified after the royal decrees to convert to Catholicism or leave Castile resulted in hundreds of thousands of forcible conversions, and the persecution of conversos and moriscos, and the mass expulsion. And to be fair, they're still just not very progressive over there. I mean, speaking of witchcraft and Dionysus, Sting, the Crowleyite and musician, recently attempted Loch Ness and Boleskine summoner turned wine grower, is facing trouble as his biodynamic production of wine in Spain and in Tuscan vineyards has been accused by European wine growers as witchcraft. Biodynamic agriculture, which is popular, uses manure, animal intestines, and cow horns, as well as fish meal to get the most out of the grapes while relying on the movement of the stars and treating the earth as a living and receptive organism. something that would have gotten Sting burned at the stake not too long ago. Yet also something that would be quite at home in Lord Bacon's Silva Salvarum, and likely an acceptable practice in New Atlantis. During these allegedly dark ages, the lights were on in Arabic Spain. Now, during the Anglo Spring of the Enlightenment, Spain's illumination had grown medievally dim. Historic accounts of the numbers of Jews who left Spain were based on speculation, and some aspects were exaggerated by early accounts and historians, but something like 1 million people, certifiable by evidence. The most intense period of persecution of conversos lasted into the 1550s, but in 1600 there was a rebound of persecutions when a group of crypto-Jewish conversos were discovered in Quintanar de la Orden. This led to rapid increase in the trials of these crypto-conversos, amongst them a number of important financiers. In 1691, during a number of auto de fe in Mallorca, 37 chuetas or conversos of Mallorca were burned. This is all after centuries of a golden era of Islamic Spain, which emphasized tolerance and science, and a much bigger Spain that included Holland and Persia throughout the Cordoba Caliphate. Muslim forces completed their conquest of what is now Spain, and the Islamic Caliphate stretched from Spain across North Africa and the Middle East, and was one of the largest empires in the world. Unlike other conquests, the other peoples living under Muslim rule, namely Christians and Jews, were not forced to convert to Islam. At the time, it was a rather remarkable age of multiculturalism and religious tolerance where the adherents of the three great monotheistic faiths of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam found that they could live together and learn from each other. This wasn't a perfect utopia, like Bacon's, but it was a lot closer than England ever attained, and the remnants of this Islamic empire shined clear in modern Holland, where even Spinoza was allowed to exist, and that's saying something. Ira M. Lapidus, in his book, A History of Islamic Societies, says, many Muslims came to speak Romance. Some Christians retained both their Romance languages and Visigothic Christian culture. Other Christians converted to Islam, but spoke only Romance and knew no Arabic. Still others took on Arabic language and cultural traits without becoming Muslims. Mozarab was the name applied to the Christians who were acculturated to Arabic, but not converted to Islam. People in all three categories married each other, creating new layers of hybrid family, religion, and culture. In some, there were Romance-speaking Christians as well as Romance-speaking Muslims, and Arabic-speaking Muslims and Christians. A new cultural blend came into being. It seems like Sir Francis Bacon was pretty fond of that idea. Until that culture was shattered and everyone was sent out on boats like Can Fifle a Great Mouse Tale, it seemed clear that Sir Francis Bacon had met and heard the testimonies of some of the survivors of this great period, and perhaps he romanticized it a bit into New Atlantis. When playing word association games with the name Bacon, after eggs and a few sensory adjectives like crispy come to mind, the name Kevin Bacon would likely come up pretty quickly. But there's a lot less than 6 degrees between Kevin Bacon and Sir Francis Bacon. And the surname Bacon has been around well long before either. People called Bacon have had links to everything from French Impressionism via Lucy Bacon, the only known Californian to have studied under any of the great Impressionist artists in Paris, even burlesque and vaudeville with American Faith Bacon, who is credited with inventing the genre-changing fan dance. Even in linguistic philosophy through the 13th century Franciscan friar and scholar Roger Bacon, whose ideas that all language displayed universal grammar, preceded Noam Chomsky by centuries. Throughout history, Bacons have been architects, artists, actors, athletes, musicians, politicians, preachers, soldiers, and indeed, celebrities. Nowadays, the most well-known Bacon, aside from Sir Francis Bacon, and probably far better known, to be honest, is Kevin Bacon, the star of Footloose. There's even a number of other Francis Bacons besides the philosopher. There's a Francis Bacon who plays cricket pretty well, for instance. The cricketer Francis Bacon, and there's Sir Francis Bacon's relative Francis Thomas Bacon, the 20th century engineer and inventor of the hydrogen-oxygen fuel cell, a development which allegedly powered the Columbia shuttle. In America, historically Bacons have been most common in Vermont and other areas where Puritans from England escaped or settled in the 17th century, including places in Massachusetts and the rest of New England. The Puritans tended to be wealthy enough to pay for their own passage, meaning they were more likely to be craftsmen or tradesmen than indentured servants and farmers. Wealth being a powerful aid to the survival of a namesake, Kevin Bacon is descended from a branch of Quaker Bacons, a group who left England because of religious persecution, which actually makes his star-making role as a teen with an insatiable urge to dance in Footloose all the more interesting, considering his ancestors were actually opposed to dancing on religious grounds. That actually might have been the context I needed to get Footloose. Kevin Bacon's father was Edmund Bacon, called the father of modern Philadelphia, an urban planner and one of the key figures in shaping how America looks today. He redeveloped Philadelphia in the decades following World War II, and as with other architects of the era, was treated as a celebrity, even appearing on the cover of Time magazine. Another celebrated Bacon architect is Henry Bacon, best known for designing the Lincoln Memorial. His travels in Europe brought a Greek and Roman influence to many of his most famous designs, with buildings and monuments all across America. Quite a number of Bacons have worked in the political realm. An American ambassador to France, Robert Bacon, narrowly missed returning to America on the Titanic when the new French ambassador was delayed on his way to take up the post. Of course, what's that expression? Luck is the residue of design. Bacon County, Georgia, is named for four-time senator and former Confederate soldier Augustus Octavius Bacon, who was once a substantial landowner in the South. There were Bacons who worked to overthrow slavery and segregation. Pastor and Yale professor Leonard Bacon had an enormous influence on President Abraham Lincoln. These days, according to recent census, there are just about 30,000 Bacons living in the United States alone. Despite what seems like an obvious etymology, the surname Bacon doesn't have anything to do with cured meats at all. One possible root is the old Germanic Bach, as in the Bach sagas, possibly from a root meaning to fight, which appeared in Old French as Bacchus. Bacchus was the unrestrained Roman god of wine and viticulture. Bacchus was the bringer of ecstasies and the inducer of frenzied states, such as creativity and religious devotion, also known as Eleutherios, or the liberator. Bacchus represented the spontaneous and unrestrained aspects of life. The Romans believed that Bacchus operated through inducing a state of drunkenness into his corporeal vessels. This state freed the inebriated from social conventions and allowed new ways of thinking and acting, a parallel in the life of Sir Francis Bacon. Bacchus was commonly depicted carrying a Xirtus or staff wrapped with ivy and dripping with honey, while munching on a grapevine and drinking from his chalice. Originally, the Roman festival held in honor of Bacchus, the Bacchanals or the Bacchanalia, have come to mean any occasion of wild and drunk revelry. The Latin name Bacchus is descended from the Greek word Bacchos, an epithet of the Greek god Dionysus. That word Bacchus itself was derived from the term Bacchia, used to describe the hypnotic and manic state that the god produced in mortal beings. In appropriating the name Bacchus, then, the Latins were claiming an aspect of Dionysus for their own god. Bacchus could also be related to the Latin word bacca, meaning a berry, or the fruit of a tree or shrub, or perhaps a misalliteration of the vulgar Latin for vacca, meaning cattle. In this context, such a word could be referencing a sort of smurfberry-like grape, the key ingredient in wine, or their Smurfy Valley. The mythology of Bacchus centers on the birth, death, and unlikely rebirth through the figure of the mortal simile. The first birth happened in a conventional manner for the gods. Jupiter became smitten with Proserpina, who was usually presented as the daughter of the great kings of the gods, assuming the form of a serpent. Jupiter slithered into the underworld and made love to Proserpina. During this encounter, they conceived a child, Bacchus. In the Roman tradition, the first incarnation of the god was called Liber, the root of the word liberty. This detail was an acknowledgement of the wine god whom the Romans worshipped prior to adopting the cult of Dionysus. It is possible that this was a Saxon title of Hellenic origin, and that it came to England with the Normans in 1066 and became Bacchun and Bacon. Another possibility also from the Normans was the French name Bascon or Bacot. Almost a century after the Norman conquest of Britain, the first recorded spellings of the family name, that of William Bacon, appear around 1150 in the county of Staffordshire. So whichever branch of Bacons any of these modern bearers of the name are descended, they're likely within 6 degrees of separation from somebody who helped shape the world and Western civilization, to say the least. Francis's inhabitants of Bensalem are described as having high moral character and honesty. as no official accepts any payment from individuals. The people are also described as chaste and pious. In the third act, the head of Solomon House takes on one of the European visitors to show him all the scientific background of Solomon House, where experiments are conducted in Baconian method to understand and conquer nature, and to apply the collected knowledge to the betterment of society. Namely, 1, to the end of their foundation, 2, to the preparations they have for their works, 3, to the several employments and functions whereto their fellows are assigned, and 4, to the ordinances and rites which they observe. In New Atlantis, Sir Francis Bacon portrays a vision of the future, of human discovery and knowledge. The plan and organization of his ideal college, the Solomon's House, envisions the modern research university in both applied and pure science. Bacon writes, "The end of our foundation is the knowledge of causes and the secret motion of things, and the enlarging of the bounds of human empire, to the effecting of all things possible. For the several employments and offices of our fellows, we have 12 that sail into foreign countries, under the names of other nations. For our own we conceal, who bring us the book and the abstracts, and patterns of experiments of all other parts. These we call the merchants of light. We have 3 that collect the experiments which are in all books. These we call depredators. We have 3 that collect the experiments of all mechanical arts, and also of liberal sciences, and also of the practices which are not brought into arts. We call these the mystery men. And we have 3 more that try new experiments, such experiments as themselves think good. These we call pioneers, or miners. We have 3 that draw the experiments of the former 4 into titles and tables to give the better light for the drawing of observations and axioms out of them. These we call compilers. We have 3 that bend themselves, looking into the experiments of their fellows, and cast about how to draw out of them things of use and practice, for man's life and knowledge, as well for works, for plain demonstration of causes, means of natural divinations, and the easy and clear discovery of the virtues and parts of body. These we call dowrymen, or benefactors. Then, after diverse meetings and consults of our whole number, to consider of the former labors and collections, we have 3 that take care out of them to direct new experiments, of a higher light, more penetrating into nature than the other former. These we call the lamps. We have 3 others that do execute the experiments so directed, and report them, and we call these the inoculators. But lastly, we have 3 that raise the former discoveries by experiments into greater observations, axioms, and aphorisms. These we call interpreters of nature. These roles of the philosopher-scientist in Bacon's Solomon House and illustrate Bacon's first formation of his modern scientific method. But the method was put forward in a different Bacon book, Novum Organum, or The New Method, in 1620, and was supposed to replace the methods put forward in Aristotle's Organon. The method was influential upon the development of the scientific method in modern science, but also, more generally, in the early modern rejection of medieval Aristotelianism, which was usually characterized by deductive logic, and an analytic inductive method in the study of nature and of natural law. Aristotelianism answers why questions by a scheme of 4 cases, including purpose or teleology, and emphasizes virtue ethics. Bacon method conflicts with Aristotelianism in physics, biology, metaphysics, logic, ethics, aesthetics, poetry, theater, music, rhetoric, psychology, linguistics, economics, politics, and government. Indeed, in its very philosophy, in many ways, this Baconian ontology was a very different way to observe and interact with the world than what had been normative at his time. Bacon's method is an example of the application of inductive reasoning. However, Bacon's method of induction is much more complex than the essential inductive process of making generalizations from observations. Bacon's method begins with descriptions of the requirements for making the careful, systematic observations necessary to produce quality facts. Bacon then proceeds to use induction, the ability to generalize from a set of facts to one or more axioms. However, Bacon stresses the necessity of not generalizing, beyond what the facts truly demonstrate. The next step may be to gather additional data, or the researcher may use existing data and the new axioms to establish additional facts. Specific types of facts can be particularly useful, such as negative instances, exceptional instances, and data from experiments. The whole process is repeated in a stepwise fashion to build an increasingly complex base of knowledge, but one which is always supported by observed facts, or more generally speaking, empirical data. Bacon argues in the Novum Organum that our only hope for building true knowledge is through this careful method. Old knowledge-building methods were often not based in facts, but on broad, ill-proven deductions and metaphysical conjecture. Even when theories were based in fact, they were often broad generalizations and/or abstractions from few instances of casually gathered observations. Using Bacon's process, humanity could start fresh, setting aside old superstitions, overgeneralizations, and traditional unproven, quote, facts. Researchers could slowly but accurately build an essential base of knowledge from the ground up. Describing then existing knowledge, Bacon claims there is the same degree of licentiousness and error in forming axioms as in abstracting notions, and in the first principles which depend in common induction versus Baconian induction. Still, more is this the case in axioms and inferior propositions derived from syllogisms. While Bacon advocated a very empirical, observational, reasoned method that did away with metaphysical conjecture, as he put it, Bacon was a religious man, and indeed a mystic. Bacon believed in God and believed his works had a religious role. He contended, like other researchers at the time, that by doing this careful work, man could begin to understand God's wonderful creation, to reclaim the knowledge that had been lost in Adam and Eve's fall, and to make the most of his God-given talents. Bacon also foresaw that the design of experiments could be improved. In describing the ordinances and rites observed by the scientists of Solomon House, the head of the Solomon House says, "We have certain hymns and services which we say daily, of the Lord, and thanks to God for his marvelous works, and some forms of prayer, imploring his aid and blessing, for the illumination of our labors, and the turning of them into good and holy uses." And finally, after showing all the scientific background of Solomon's house, Bacon gives the European visitors permission to publish it. And when he had said this, he stood up, and I, as I had been taught, kneeled down. And he laid his right hand upon my head and said, "God bless thee, my son, and God bless this relation, which I have made. I give thee leave to publish it for the good of the other nations, for we here are in God's bosom, a land unknown." So it's kind of like Wakanda. Actually, Bensalem is composed of two Hebrew words, Ben meaning son, and Salem, or Shalem, meaning whole or complete. The name could be interpreted as the son of wholeness, but it would be worth considering the Latin prefix bene as well. And I can't help but notice some parallels in the secrets of Nim as well. I mean, even the way the House of Strangers receives Christianity. Earlier in the story, the governor of the House of Strangers relates the incredible circumstances. About 20 years after the ascension of our Savior, it came to pass that there was seen by the people of Renfusa, a city upon the eastern coast of our island, within sight. The night was cloudy and calm, as it might be some mile in the sea. A great pillar of light, not sharp, but in form of a column or cylinder, rising out from the sea, a great way up towards the heavens. And on the top of it was seen a large cross of light, more bright and resplendent than the body of the pillar, upon which was so strange a spectacle. The people of the city gathered apace together upon the sands, to wonder, and so after put themselves into a number of small boats, to go nearer to this marvelous sight. But when the boats were come within about 60 yards of the pillar, they found themselves all bound, and could not go further. Yet so as they might move to go about, so as the boat stood all as in a theatre, beholding this light as a heavenly sign, it so fell out that there was in one of the boats one of the wise men of the society of Solomon's house, who having a while attentively and devoutly viewed and contemplated this pillar and cross, fell down upon his face, and then raised himself upon his knees, and lifting up his hands to the heaven, made his prayers in this manner: "Lord, God of heaven and earth, thou hast vouchsafed of thy grace to those of our order to know thy works of creation, and true secrets of them, and to discern, as far as appertaineth to the generations of men, between divine miracles, works of nature, works of art, and impostures. I do here acknowledge and testify before these people that the thing we now see before our eyes is thy finger, and a true miracle. And for so much as we learn in our books that thou never workest miracles, the laws of nature are thine own laws, and thou exceedest them, not but upon great cause. We most humbly beseech thee to prosper this great sign, and to give us the interpretation and use of it in mercy, which thou dost in some part secretly promise, by sending it unto us. Later, the father of Solomon House reveals the institution's skill at creating illusions of light. We represent also all multiplications of light which we carry to great distance, and make so sharp as to discern small points and lines. Also all colorations of light, all delusions and deceits of the sight, in figures, magnitudes, motions, and colors, all demonstrations of shadows. We find also diverse means, yet unknown to you, of producing light, originally from the diverse bodies. Light orbs in glass balls with electricity. He also boasts about their ability to use science to fake miracles, saying, "And surely you will easily believe that we, that have so many things truly natural, which induce admiration, could in a world of particulars deceive the senses, if we would disguise those things, and labor to make them more miraculous." In the Latin translation of the second passage, which was published as part of Opera Moralium et Silvillium Thomas in 1638 by William Raleigh, Bacon's amanuensis is stronger in Latin and literally translates to, "We could impose upon men's senses an infinite number of things, if we wanted to present these things as, and exalt them into, a miracle." While this has been read as Bacon suggesting that the story, if not the miracle itself, was an invention emanating from Solomon's house, this is perhaps not a safe inference. The relevance of the brother of Solomon's house to the story of the island's conversion to Christianity is more of an indication that the institution itself has reached a point in its knowledge from which it can ascertain whether an occurrence is natural or not. It is this knowledge and its humble appreciation that allows for the revelation itself to be delivered. As the Zohar says, the veil will not be lifted to ruin the surprise. The skills of creating illusion, coupled with the incredibility of the story of the origin of Bensalem's Christianity, makes it seem that Bacon was intimating that the light show, or at least the story of its occurrence, was an invention of the Solomon House, or perhaps another discovery from another book washed up on the shores. The presence of Hebrews, Persians, and Indians, and citizens of Tartary in Bensalem at the time implies that the Asian people were already in the 1st century engaged in sailing across the Pacific, which is historically accurate, yet seemed implausible at the time of writing. And who runs Bensalem? If there is a guardian, it seems the children are fully grown. The father of Solomon's house reveals that the members of the institution decide on their own which of their discoveries to keep secret, even from the state. And this we do also. We have consultations. Which of the inventions and experiences which we have discovered shall be published, and which will not, and take all of an oath of secrecy for the concealing of these things which we think fit to be kept secret, though some of those we do reveal sometimes to the state, yet sometimes not. This would seem to imply that the state does not hold the monopoly on authority, and that Solomon's house must in some sense be superior to the state. While Bacon appears concerned with the house of Solomon, a portion of the narrative describes the social practices of the Bensalemites, particularly those surrounding courtship and family life. An example of these rituals is the Adam and Eve pools. Here betrothed send surrogates to observe the other bathing to discover any deformities. Here Bacon alludes to Sir Thomas More's Utopia from 1516. Where Thomas More describes a similar ritual. However, the crucial difference is, rather than surrogates, the young couple observes the other naked. Bacon's character Jobin remarks on this difference. "I have read in a book of one of your men of a feigned commonwealth where the married couple are permitted, before their contract, to see one another naked. Scientifically, this is gratuitous." In Bacon's theological tracts, there are 2 prayers, named the student prayer and the writer's prayer, which may be a demonstration of how scientists could pray, as described in New Atlantis. New Atlantis and other writings of Sir Francis Bacon inspired both the formation of the Royal Society and inspired Jonathan Swift to parody Bacon's works in his Gulliver's Travels. Sir Francis Bacon saw witch burning go from common practice to illegal in his lifetime. Later, separation between church and state would become more relevant and tested in the emerging New World Order, and a number of Baconians and Rosicrucians would follow in suit. Johannes Kelpius, born Johann Kelp, a young esoteric scholar who led a band of pilgrims out of the Rhine Valley to found a mystic colony on the banks of the Wissahickon Creek outside of Philadelphia in 1694. Mother Ann Lee, a working-class girl from Manchester, England, who escaped charges of sorcery and brought her sect, the Shaking Quakers, later called the Shakers, to New York State in 1775, launching one of the first religious communes of the New World. Jemima Wilkinson, a Rhode Island Quaker girl who in 1776, at the age of 24, claimed to have died and returned to life as a supernatural medium called the Public Universal Friend. She became the first American-born female religious leader. Andrew Jackson Davis, called the Poughkeepsie Seer, after his Hudson Valley, New York home, who enthralled 19th century Americans with his visions of heaven as a place that included all the world's peoples, blacks, whites, Indians, slaves, Jews, and followers of every faith. The spirit of tolerance and openness that suffused esoteric movements in early America forged a bond between the occult and liberalism. This was especially true in the 19th century movements of spiritualism, or contacting the dead, a time when newspapers' demographics and followers were ardently abolitionists, reformists, and suffragists. Spiritualism became the first movement in modern life in which women could openly serve as religious leaders, and science was the second. Most trance mediums were women. And for a generalization in the 19th century, the movement of spiritualism and suffragists grew hand in hand, often sharing the same leadership. For Americans who believed in liberal social and religious ideals, the messages emanating from occult movements, namely the equality of all religions and peoples, the rights of ordinary people to devise their own religious spiritual paths, and the therapeutic properties of faith, were perhaps more enthralling than any other supernatural claims. Bacon cannot be unaccredited in the consequences to this unfolding. It was this kind of impartiality to the past that opened the doors to the new future, for better or for worse. It was believed by the Rosicrucian organization Amorc that Bacon would have influenced the settlement of the mystics in North America, stating that the new Atlantis inspired a colony of Rosicrucians, led by Johann Kelp, to journey across the Atlantic Ocean in a chartered vessel called Sarah Maria and move on to Pennsylvania in the late 17th century. According to their claims, the Rosicrucian communities made valuable contributions to the newly emerging American culture in the fields of printing, philosophy, science, and the arts.
Hey, everybody, tune in to Recent Targaryens.
Recent Targaryens. Recent Targaryens.